Hello students, my name is Dr. Lewis and I will be your lecturer this semester for a course entitled Western Civilization 1500 to the Present. Our first lecture in this course is going to be on the subject of feudalism and the birth of the Atlantic world. In each of our lectures, we'll start off asking a number of questions about the subject matter to address a number of themes concerning our lecture for the day. With today's lecture, we'll be asking the questions of number 1, who ruled over traditional European society? Number 2, what role did religion play in European life? Number 3, what challenged this traditional order that we'd refer to as medieval society? And number 4, what is the Atlantic world? Another way of phrasing that final question is, in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, what was significant about Columbus's voyage, and how did it impact the life of Europeans? Traditional European society was defined by a social system called feudalism. Feudalism was a very strict social system where approximately 10% of the people who lived under a feudal system were part of what we would call the nobility. The next 10% were part of the Roman Catholic Church, people would refer to as the clergy, and the other 80% of society, well, that was everyone else. They were referred to as commoners. These were the people who worked, who fought, and who prayed a lot. And we'll get to the reason why they prayed so much in just a moment. A textbook definition of feudalism would be, quote, a social system in which people worked and fought for nobles who gave them protection and the use of land in return. Since all power and wealth was based upon land ownership, it was very important to understand legally who could own land and who couldn't own land. Traditionally, the only people in Europe who could own land were people who were part of the nobility. The reason why they were able to own such land is that the king gave them land deeds in exchange that if the kingdom were ever under attack or under threat, that those nobles would raise a certain number of soldiers to protect the king and to protect the kingdom. The way that one was able to become part of the nobility was, for most people, to be born into it. Essentially, people who got all of their wealth and all of their power by simply being born, not by doing any hard work or by doing anything productive, really. If you were a commoner and you wanted to be part of this larger social system and be able to own land and to have a title someday, you became a knight. A knight is essentially, if you think about a modern pyramid scam, a knight would be the entry-level position into this pyramid scam. A knight is somebody who was a commoner who dedicated their entire life to military training and military service to protect the king and the nobility up here on the top of this pyramid. Now, the way land was passed down from generation to generation, and titles within the nobility being passed down, was that land and the title would be passed down to the firstborn son. Now, if you were a woman, or you were the second-born son, you could either A, try and marry another noble person who had land, and you could become part of the system. If you were a younger brother, you could try and kill your older brother, and then you would inherit the land and the title. Or you could be part of a very powerful part of society called the clergy. Traditionally in Europe, this would constitute being a member of the Roman Catholic Church, either as a priest, a monk, or a nun. What's important to understand about the clergy traditionally is that the Roman Catholic Church, prior to the Protestant Reformation, controlled everything about politics and about personal salvation. Essentially, if you were part of the church, it wasn't so much about developing somebody's spiritual life, it was about controlling the world around you. And the way that you enforced this world around you and controlled people was, you said, it was part of God's will. And for the fact that the majority of people were illiterate, if they questioned you on this, you would say, well, it's in the Bible. And they'd say, show me. But if you can't read and you can't write and somebody simply says it's in the Bible, well, you can get away with a lot of corruption. To understand then what the condition was of most common people. Most common people They worked all of the time, primarily farmers. If the kingdom was under threat, they would fight all of the time to protect that kingdom because that was their duty under feudalism. And most of them were incredibly religious and prayed all of the time. The main reason being that feudalism and medieval life, well, for most people, medieval life, in academic terms, sucks. It absolutely sucks. There's no social advancement, there's no ownership for most people, and most people, yeah, their life sucks. It's the easiest way to understand this. So when your life is about working, fighting, and praying, Our story for this course starts out just after 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, not trying to discover the Americas, but in his attempt to find a sea route to get to Asia. Prior to Columbus's voyages, Europeans had been engaged in international trade primarily with the Kingdom of China for centuries, of European traders traveling to China primarily through land routes to purchase luxury goods to bring back to Europe to sell off to aristocrats. Traditionally, the way Europeans engaged in this trade is they traveled from areas of Western Europe, traveled across what we now know as Russia at the time of what was called the Silk Roads. They purchased goods in China, then brought them back across the Silk Roads to Western Europe to sell off primarily to rich people. The problem with this trade is starting in around the year 1347, engaging in such trade on land routes could possibly kill you. It's one thing to be attracted to making money, but it's a whole other thing the prospect that your job might land you in a grave. The problem in 1347 is in southeastern parts of China, a disease broke out called the bubonic plague, which once it arrived in Europe was referred to commonly as the Black Death. The bubonic plague, when it started off in southeastern parts of China, historians approximate that up to 1/3 of China's population died during the first decade. Once this disease started spreading across the Silk Roads and ended up in Europe, historians approximate that during the first generation it arrived in Europe, that almost 50% of Europe's population was killed off by this disease. While this was a time before medical knowledge and before any understanding about bacteria and biology, it didn't take a rocket scientist to understand that people who travel along the Silk Road would get exposed to the disease and potentially die. So more and more traders who had been engaging in this international trade stopped looking at the Silk Roads and looked for other routes to be able to get to China. Your next major route to get to China, bypassing the Silk Roads, is to go from Western Europe to cross through the straits here at Constantinople to go into Turkey and what we now know as the Middle East, and to travel across the Middle East to get to Asia. The problem with this is a series of wars that lasted for about 250 years called the Crusades. Pope Urban X launched the First Crusade in the year 1095, trying to unite European Christians in some type of common mission to invade the Middle East to reconquer the holy city of Jerusalem, which is right around there. In order to achieve this, Europeans would first start their military campaigns by starting off in the holy city of Constantinople, of what is now known as Istanbul, the modern capital of Turkey. Europeans would start in Constantinople and then launch military advancements going through Turkey and coming in here either through the Mediterranean Sea or through land routes passing through Turkey. After about 250 years of Muslims in the Middle East being invaded over and over and over, Muslims finally decided, starting in the year 1453, to try and take over the city of Constantinople to stop Europeans from launching further military invasions. Starting in the year 1453, Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire realized that the holy city of Constantinople, while it traditionally had about 500,000 people living in it, now only had 50,000 people living in it, which meant it was a very easy target for military conquest. After Sultan Mehmed conquered Constantinople in the year 1453, he renamed it to the city of Istanbul. And he would still allow European traders to come from Western Europe to cross through and to cross to the Middle East. It's just throughout the Ottoman Empire, European traders who wanted to stay part of this larger international commercial system, every time they stopped in a major city, they would have to pay taxes upon the products that they were moving from China all the way back to Western Europe, which meant, well, business people don't really like taxes because taxes cost them money and they make less profit. So, if you're a European trader, you could go over the Silk Roads and maybe die. If you're a European trader, you could cross the Middle East, but you're making less money because of taxes. So all of a sudden, starting around the year 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue to try and figure out, number one, a way to not die from the plague, and number two, to not have to pay so much in taxes. And this phenomenon completely ends up transforming the experience of European people, and for people of the entire world, eventually. One of the other phenomenon that was produced by the sacking of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmed in 1453 was a new period in European history centered in Italy that is oftentimes referred to as the Renaissance. The word Renaissance literally translates out of Italian to the word rebirth. A textbook definition of the Renaissance would be, quote, a period ranging roughly from the 14th through the 16th century, marking the transition from medieval to modern times, characterized by the revival of classical art, architecture, literature, and learning. For those of you who know something about the humanities and art history, this was a time of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, people who explored the world, explored the beauty of the world and the complexity of the world, not just through theology, but through reproductions of nature, an understanding of the ancient world, and trying to apply modern ideas about science to the world around them. The problem, and what helped to bring about a triggering of the Renaissance, was that most of the knowledge of the ancient world had shifted out of Europe and into the Middle East, primarily in the city of Constantinople, throughout what we would call the medieval era. After Sultan Mehmed conquered Constantinople, a huge number of European intellectuals who had been centered there, who had kept on the knowledge of the ancient world, fled Constantinople as religious refugees and fled to what we now know as the modern nation of Italy. While they were in Italy, they brought back many of the ideas of the ancient and classical world to revive ideas about secularism and science in European society. During the medieval era, most people who would call themselves philosophers and intellectuals centered all of their ideas about trying to prove that God existed and prove any preconceived ideas about the world and about the universe that the Roman Catholic Church held. While they emphasized some ideas about community and service, which was a positive thing, for the most part, pre-Renaissance intellectuals simply reinforced the status quo of society and reinforced the traditional view of feudalism. What began to change during the era of the Renaissance was that instead of trying to find God in all things, intellectuals started to try and find the experience of humanity in all things, starting to promote learning, starting to challenge ideas about society, and saying that the role of an individual is prominent in trying to transform society, not just to reinforce the status quo. Ultimately, the importance of the Renaissance was it began the process around the year 1500 of undermining the cultural power of the Roman Catholic Church, which had come to dominate all aspects of how people looked at the world and how people studied the world around them. While the Renaissance helped to undermine the cultural power and dominance of the Roman Catholic Church, it was a process referred to as the Reformation that undermined ultimately undermined the political power of the Roman Catholic Church. The person who started the process, now historically referred to as the Reformation, was a very unlikely character from areas of northern Germany, a Roman Catholic monk named Martin Luther. Starting around the year 1517, Martin Luther started critiquing a number of practices of the Roman Catholic Church, not to undermine the Roman Catholic Church, but in a hope to reform what he saw as corrupt practices of the Roman Catholic Church. First and foremost on Martin Luther's critiques of the Roman Catholic Church was a practice referred to as indulgences. What indulgences were essentially a way for people of wealth and status, particularly aristocrats, to buy their way out of hell. A wealthy person could sin over and over and over, and according to traditional Christian theology, unless they fully repented, they would go to hell. One of the things the Roman Catholic Church practiced up until the year 1517 was that if you were a wealthy person and you donated a certain amount of money to the church, you'd be pardoned from hell and could go to eternal salvation. Now, the problem with the practice of indulgences, the reason why the Catholic Church did this was after several hundred years of launching military campaigns into the Middle East, much like our modern times, they were in a lot of debt. Military campaigns cost a lot of money, particularly when trying to invade countries in the Middle East. To try and make up for this lack of funds, the Roman Catholic Church came up with indulgences as a way to try and get rich people to pay off their debts from the Crusades. Martin Luther said that the way the Roman Catholic Church would try to justify this practice, they said that it was simply something in the Bible. And for the fact that most people were illiterate and that the Bible traditionally was only printed in the language of Latin. The only people who could read Latin were highly educated people or priests. So essentially the Roman Catholic Church could get away with what we'd call modern times a con job. They would simply say, oh, yeah, the practice of indulgences, that's in the Bible, and read the Bible. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't read. Just pay us the money. Here's the issue. Martin Luther wrote what was called his 95 Theses, a number of critiques about the Roman Catholic Church that he apparently printed up and stapled to the side of a local monastery. Had he done this a generation earlier, he would have had absolutely no impact upon the world. But starting around the year 1517, a new technology imported from China had been brought to Europe called the printing press, which meant that Martin Luther's ideas could be printed on paper and spread throughout the continent of Europe and eventually to places such as the British Isles, being translated to English. Had he done these things a generation earlier, they couldn't have been reprinted, the ideas wouldn't have spread, and Martin Luther would have had zero impact upon the world. The problem is that Martin Luther's ideas spread so quickly that Pope Leo X, who was at the time head of the Roman Catholic Church, decided that Martin Luther had committed a horrible sin against the church, and he decided in 1521 to excommunicate Martin Luther from the church. Now, according to traditional Catholic ideology, if one is excommunicated from the church by the Pope, that means that person is damned for eternity. And for people who supported Martin Luther's critiques of the Roman Catholic Church, they believed, starting in the year 1521, that Pope Leo X had condemned Martin Luther's soul to hell. Many of these people saw this simply as a corruption by an individual who had no ordinance from God, but was simply a corrupt political individual. What many of these followers of Martin Luther then did was they decided to leave the Roman Catholic Church to start up their own churches based upon a tradition called Protestantism. The main thing that the Pope disliked about the idea of Protestant faith was not so much that wealth wasn't coming to the Pope anymore. It's that traditionally the Pope was in charge of anointing kings and queens in charge of different kingdoms. Kings and queens had justified their position ruling over kingdoms by what was called the divine right of rule, where essentially they said, I'm in charge of this kingdom because God has said so. And the way that you justify this and prove this traditionally in Europe is that you have God's appointed leader on earth, who traditionally is the Pope, give you the thumbs up. Which means if the Pope gives you the seal of approval, that means you have God's seal of approval, and you are A-OK. But it also means if you make the Pope angry, the Pope can take away the seal of approval, God no longer approves you, and you can't be king or queen anymore according to the Church. And here's the real crux of the Protestant Reformation, is that it completely undermined the political power of the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Roman Catholic Church launched what was referred to oftentimes as the Counter-Reformation, trying to scare people from joining the Protestant movement, or if they had joined the Protestant movement, try and scare them to return back to the Roman Catholic Church. In the big picture, historically, the Protestant Reformation had some positive outcomes, eventually, leading to new ideas about the individual and leading to political ideas such as democracy. Initially, though, the Protestant Reformation had a horrible impact upon European society, leading to persecution and constant civil warfare as the Roman Catholic Church attempted to re-establish its legitimacy over all of European society. The first phenomenon of what's oftentimes referred to as the Catholic Counter-Reformation is what we call the Spanish Inquisition. While the Spanish Inquisition might be funny, let's say, in Monty Python skits, the reality of the Inquisition was horrible for those who lived through it. Essentially, a representative of the Roman Catholic Church who was called an inquisitor would take different individuals who were perceived of committing heresy against the Roman Catholic Church and put them through a series of religious tests to see if God was actually on their side or on the side of the Roman Catholic Church. The main test the inquisitors used was a horrible form of torture called the Iron Maiden. While the Iron Maiden eventually became, in the 1970s, a fantastic English heavy metal band, the Iron Maiden of the Spanish Inquisition is a horrible torture device where essentially you have a coffin where on each side of the coffin there are spikes, and you put somebody in the coffin and you close the door. When the coffin is opened, if the person is still alive, it is because God has intervened on their behalf to show that they are not a heretic. But if the person was dead, then it was obvious that God was not on their side with a miracle, and therefore was a heretic. And as far as historians know, I don't believe anyone ever survived the Iron Maiden. Therefore, it was a test that was really stacked against people who critiqued the Roman Catholic Church to prove that they were heretics. The persecution and the violence of the Spanish Inquisition led to a series of religious wars that lasted well over a century in Europe, starting off in France in the year 1562 with people that you might have heard of before, people like Joan of Arc, who believed in different religious ideas, and that led to warfare. The Civil War in France lasted for about 40 years, and almost immediately after its aftermath, a war started out in northern Germany that ended up spreading over the entire continent of Europe, referred to as the 30 Years' War. These ideas about the Reformation and the role of Protestants eventually led to the Kingdom of England, where you've probably heard King Henry VIII, to try and justify his divorce from a number of his wives, created his own church, a Protestant church called the Anglican Church, where he was considered the head of the church. This eventually culminated in a series of civil wars in England from 1642 to 1649 that led to the overthrow of King Charles I, who was overthrown by a Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell. What Oliver Cromwell did to try to show to the English people that King Charles I was not divinely in charge of the Kingdom of England is he had King Charles I executed, committing a crime that we would refer to as regicide, which essentially is defined as the killing of a king. For the fact that Oliver Cromwell, as a Puritan, said that King Charles I was not divinely put in place by God, and that he, in the name of God, could kill off a king, it undermined the entire concept of the role of the divine right of rule throughout European society. This phenomenon intensified over the next several generations as each religious brand, whether Protestant or Catholic, started bringing the devil to a central figure in the religious schemes. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, the devil was simply a character in biblical terms who never really played a very prominent role. What Protestants started doing after the Reformation was saying that the Pope was the head of the armies of the Antichrist, that the end of times were coming, and that those who were part of the Roman Catholic Church were on the side of the devil, and that a religious war was going to break out, bringing the end of the world, to bring Christ back into power to rule over the planet for 1,000 years. What Catholics did to try and counter this recruitment method from Protestants was they started embracing ideas about demonic possession and the devil, essentially saying that Protestants, for the fact that Protestants did not accept the Pope, that they must somehow be possessed by the devil. And that if somebody was possessed by the devil and no longer part of the Roman Catholic Church, they could not receive an exorcism, and therefore the only way to stop the devil was to kill the devil. What this resulted in is essentially Protestants said, hey, my Catholic neighbor, they're part of the armies of the Antichrist, I should kill them. And what the Catholics said in turn is they said, oh, my Protestant neighbor, they're possessed by the devil, they have no salvation, therefore I should kill them. And for centuries, what Europe turned into is instead of European Christians going off and killing people of other faiths during the times of the Crusades, was people saying if you were the wrong brand of Christianity, you must somehow be associated with the devil, and therefore, to prove myself as a worthy Christian, I should kill this other person who calls themselves a Christian, who is the wrong brand of Christianity. And if you were a commoner during this time, even if you didn't have a view on these religious wars, you were oftentimes drafted into armies to try and kill Christians on the other side of the Christian divide between Protestant and Catholic, to try and stomp out the devil, which meant over and over Europeans, whether they liked it or not, were forced into wars not of their choosing, and that was based upon almost exclusively religious ideas. To remove themselves from the inability for social mobility under feudalism, and to get away from many of the religious wars going on throughout the European continent, more and more Europeans started engaging in a new system of globalization referred to as Atlantic world commerce. Traditionally, globalization had been centered upon Europeans purchasing products from China, primarily luxury products, to sell off to wealthy Europeans. After Columbus's discoveries in 1492 concerning trade routes not to Asia, but to the Americas, more and more Europeans started engaging in what is oftentimes referred to as a triangular trade system. Now, if we give an example here to understand the geography of what's called the Atlantic world, what we're talking about here is people from Western Europe traveling to areas of Western Africa, trading products here in Western Africa, going across the Atlantic, initially to the Caribbean, trading products for other products here in the Caribbean, and eventually coming all the way across the Atlantic back to Western Europe, selling off these products and becoming incredibly wealthy outside of the traditional bonds of feudalism. What the triangular trade did was it created, number one, a new elite class of non-nobles who were engaged in international trade who became incredibly wealthy. What it also did is it created a new consumer society throughout the world where people, commoners, started being able to buy consumer products that were not luxury products that they could afford, that weren't necessarily necessary to their lifestyle. Now, if we break down this Atlantic world commerce that became the basis for modern wealth, what we're talking about here is people leaving from Western Europe, sailing in ships to Western Africa. What they would bring upon these ships was primarily they would bring guns with them. When they arrived in Western Africa, they would trade these guns for human beings, who they would then term to be slaves, essentially trading modern technology for human beings. These slaves then were put upon ships that were not designed for humans, but designed for dry cargo, taken 4 to 6 weeks across the Atlantic in one of the most horrifying phenomena that modern humans ever engaged in. We'll talk about it in a later lecture. And these human beings were then traded off in the Caribbean for sugar and for tobacco. These ships were then filled up with sugar and tobacco, sailed all the way across the Atlantic, and sold off in Western Europe at incredibly cheap prices. And the reason why these products were so cheap was because they were produced by slave labor here in the Americas. Essentially for the fact that Europeans enjoyed getting drunk from rum, drinking tea with sugar, and smoking a lot of cigarettes. We're going to see during the history of this, approximately 15 to 20 million human beings kidnapped from one continent, taken across the Atlantic to another continent, enslaved to create cheap consumer products, and sold off here in Western Europe. And the big picture, what we're going to see, is this new merchant class engaged in the Atlantic world trade, starting to make demands upon the political systems of Europe, saying, now that we have money, even though we don't have titles, and that our wealth is not based upon land, we should have some say in politics. In a later lecture, we'll talk about this with the phenomenon of the French Revolution, as people involved in international trade, people would refer to as merchants, say that feudalism is no longer acceptable, and that people of wealth, who have gained their wealth through international commerce, should have a say in politics. Essentially, in a big picture, we're going to see what helped to bring a birth of ideas of democracy, war, religious civil war going on in Europe, and the enslavement and destruction of African populations to create a consumer society, and that these new merchants will claim that feudalism is no longer acceptable, and that new ideas about democracy should be spread out, not for all people to have a say in politics, but for people of wealth and commerce to have a say in politics. We'll discuss this in a further lecture after we discuss the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutions. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you next time.